All right, guys. So far you've done the first lesson in the unit where we kind of just gave you the overview and just kind of explained how the whole Cold War is really just about the U.S. competing with the USSR. So it's capitalist democratic U.S. versus communist dictatorship USSR, and it is these two countries and these two sides kind of competing with each other on the world stage for global dominance, and that's really the big theme for the unit. So and then we went on. You guys took a look at Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plans, and we talked about the Berlin Wall. And then you guys went on. You did some work on Stalin, find out what kind of guy he was, so you could see who exactly is leading the Soviet Union. And we're just going to kind of wrap up the Soviet side of things by just talking about what are the other different ways that the U.S. and the USSR competed during the Cold War. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So here we go. U.S. and USSR competed in every aspect that we can think of. Space travel, the space race, aka who can stockpile the most weapons, who can stockpile the most nukes, who's better at sports, etc. Famously, in 1980, the United States took on the Russians in the Winter Olympics ice hockey tournament. And in the semifinal game, the U.S. beat the Soviet Union in a humongous upset. The Soviet Union had beaten the U.S. By like 7 goals or something like that earlier in the tournament, and the U.S. actually beat them in the semifinals. Gigantic upset. One of the most famous sporting events in American history ends with the call from the announcer, Al Michaels, one of the most famous sports calls in all time, where he says, "Do you believe in miracles?" At the end of the game when the U.S. wins. Super famous sporting event. Other than sports, I mean, they compete in a lot of different ways. You can take a look at this chart, on the bottom, and it really spells out, like with regard to kind of developing a military, how the Warsaw Pact countries and the NATO countries kind of stack up against each other. And you could see that the Warsaw Pact countries have more of everything. They, are beating the NATO countries 3-1 with regard to the production of tanks and other pieces of heavy artillery, and they have almost twice as many troops. So they are really putting it to the U.S. with regard to militarization and development of military infrastructure. So that's going to be tough for the U.S. to overcome. I mean, also the space race. So the United States and the Soviet Union were in direct competition with each other with regard to space also. So they were kind of competing with each other to see who could, leave the Earth's atmosphere first, who could put an animal in space first, who could put a man in space first, who could put a man in orbit first, et cetera, et cetera. And in all those aspects, the Soviet Union beat the United States to space in all of those different aspects. But the United States kind of gets the blue ribbon here because we were the first ones to land a man on the moon, famously. So we beat them at, getting to the moon, but they beat us pretty much in every other way with regard to the space race. So something to consider there. Major part of the Cold War is stockpiling nuclear weapons. So the United States and the USSR were also in a race, with each other to stockpile nuclear weapons. And the important thing that we should know is that it is during the early 50s here that the world develops what's called the H bomb or the hydrogen bomb. It's, this here says 2,500 times more destructive than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we see, and you think back, and we looked at some slides and pictures of this, of the destruction that's caused by the atomic bombs in Japan, where it just turned everything to rubble. So we can imagine what these things are doing if they're that much stronger. These are like, drop one of these, you don't wipe out a city, you wipe out half a continent, like that kind of thing. Okay, so these things are a reality, and the United States has them. The Soviet Unions have them shortly thereafter, and it's the constant threat of these kinds of bombs being dropped on each other that kind of sets the tone for the Cold War. So those are all the different ways they compete, and to be honest, the United States and the Soviet Union will compete, and they will use other countries as their arena for competition also. Most famously, this happens in Korea. So before we really get into the nuts and bolts of the Korean War, we need a couple of important vocab words: containment, and domino theory. So these are just the ideas of the idea of containment is just we're trying to contain communism to a particular place and prevent it from spreading elsewhere. So that's containment. And then the idea of the domino theory is that, if one country that's not communist kind of falls to communism from outside influence or from, overthrow inside, if one country flips over to communism, the belief was that other countries in that area of the world will follow and they will also flip to communism shortly thereafter. So it's important to understand that. And this domino theory, this idea of, kind of the contagion of communism is going to play out in the Korean Peninsula and the Korean War. So what happens in the Korean War is it's basically North Korea with Soviet help and South Korea with American help are going to go to war with each other. So this is called a proxy war. And when we say proxy war, what you should think of, the visual in your mind should be kind of the US and the USSR are kind of puppet masters, and they are making North Korea and South Korea do their bidding. So their disagreements, the US and the USSR, are being played out through the control of smaller countries. And in this particular case, those smaller countries are North and South Korea. It's really about the US versus USSR, and it's really about capitalism versus democracy. Northern Korea was communist. South Korea is capitalist and democratic. So it's really about the conflict of these ideologies playing out on a countrywide scale. And the other thing that we need to understand is that this conflict is kind of a referendum on who was winning the Cold War at the time. So if the South were to lose, to the North, that would not be good for the American effort in the Cold War, and vice versa for the North, okay, and the Russians. So it's important to know. Spoiler alert, in the end, Korea is kind of chopped in half. The northern part of Korea will be communist, as it still is. We know from our buddy with the funny haircut. He's still up there running the show. They're communist, and South Korea is very, very much capitalist. This is where Samsung, Hyundai is located, a lot of big tech businesses. So they are famously capitalist, and that's what we need to know. So as you wrap this up, you guys can get into the documents and really start to look at some specifics about the Korean War, exactly why did it happen, exactly what happened during the war, and what is the fallout. So use the documents that are attached to complete the worksheet and submit it through Google Classroom. And if you guys need me, I will be around. You can contact me on Google Classroom or through email, and I'm here to help, all right? See you guys soon. Later.